Where do we begin? We're embarking upon a critical thinking course, and we want to know as we start, um, how do we start? Where do we start? Maybe the best way we can begin is to think about critical thinking in terms of decision making. Now, that's not the only way to think about critical thinking, but it's a way to start. It's one way to start. Every day we're confronted with decisions to make. Sometimes these decisions barely register, they're almost automatically. When I drive to school, for example, I have formed a habit of taking a certain route, but I could take other routes if I want to. Suppose that I force myself, or there's some reason for me to rethink my decision that was made long ago to take a certain route. I might take a different route. Um, there are decisions like this that are really easy to make. They're easy to make partly because they're habitual and partly because nothing seems to be at stake, right? Nothing seems to be hinging upon a decision. And it also doesn't seem as though the outcome of the decision is uncertain, right? I'm confident that whichever route I take to school, I will get to school under normal circumstances. And it's also the case that when I don't give it any thought at all, really, I just get in my car and I go. The implicit assumption is that in that choice that I've made is that I will get to school, right? But there are other decisions that are not so easy to make. Why is this? Well, it could be that there are seemingly too many choices to make in a day. Studies have been done, for example, about how as we go through our day, our choice-making capacity is diminished because we're fatigued by, let's say, the number of choices we've already made. Or suppose that I am particularly economically impoverished, and so if I go to the store, I have to be very careful about each and every choice I make. I can't just, for example, pick up a head of lettuce. I have to look at the price, right? Every single choice I make takes a toll in terms of my energy level. And so, I may, because I'm economically impoverished and so have to make so many choices, I'm super exhausted by the end of the day. Or maybe just having so many choices to make can be immensely overwhelming, right? I remember when I was in grad school, someone from a country that was engaged in a civil war had come to school and was not at all used to the sorts of amazing choices that we have in our markets. And I remember I went to the market with this new grad school colleague, and I dropped him off in the bread aisle, and then I went on my way. And I came back later, and he was still staring at all of the choices. He was so overwhelmed, he didn't know how to make a choice because there were so many bread choices, right? On the other hand, decisions can be hard to make if we not just have too many, but suppose on the other hand we have too few choices, or maybe we don't know what our choices are, and that can make decision making very difficult. So, an example would be someone I knew who was pregnant and was agonizing over whether or not to have an abortion, agonizing partly because this person was unclear about what the choices were. In other words, what the choices that could be made would involve, right? So the fact of the matter is that when we're confronted with choices, whether it's very, very many, or not enough, or seemingly not enough information to make sense of the choices, or we don't think about our choices because they're habitual, or something else, decision making is difficult. And so having some tools to help us with this process is really important. What we're going to focus on is effectively the reasonableness of the decision-making process. So let me say a little bit more about that. Many of our choices, rephrase, many of our decisions either are or do not seem to be reasonable. By this I mean that many decisions we make are motivated by something other than the outcome of rational deliberation, right? So for example, juries have been known in criminal cases to convict someone because the defendant just looks shady, or vote to acquit someone because the person just doesn't look like they could do the sort of thing of which they are accused. Now, these are exaggerations, but it's still true that we oftentimes decide to do or not to do something because of how we feel, not because of how we have reasoned. So the difficulty there is twofold, I think. One is, what's the problem with making decisions based on emotion rather than reason? And as we get clearer about that question, what is it about rational decision making that makes it, in some cases, better than others? In other words, suppose that we really focus on using reason to draw some conclusion about what to believe, about what to say, about what to do. What is it that makes some reasoning better than other reasoning, right? So those are two broad areas for us to consider, right? One is what it is about being driven by our feelings, irrespective of any sort of reflection on them. And then what is it about rational reasoning that is better in some cases than other rational reasoning? Okay, so let me try to make this a little bit less abstract. So, even in our daily lives, we make judgments that are not based on rational deliberation, but let's say based on feelings, right? So, suppose you say of a friend, oh, I know my friend wouldn't say something cruel. I like my friend. In other words, you seem to draw the conclusion that your friend wouldn't say something cruel on your feelings about your friend, right? Now, it may be true that your friend hasn't said something cruel. So let's say your friend is accused of saying something cruel and you want to defend your friend and you truly believe that your friend isn't going to, wouldn't have said something cruel. The question is, what is your reason for believing this? Is feeling enough? And typically we're going to say no, partly because feelings ebb and flow. Feelings are different from one person to another, and typically when we're talking about providing good reasons for believing, for saying, for doing something, those good reasons should be applicable to anyone, right? It's not just me or you that we're talking about, right? So the reasons that I hold should be reasons that could hold for others as well. So maybe we could think about rational deliberation. We can think about reasoning as the process of solving a problem, right? So here's an example. X plus y equals 10. Moreover, y equals x plus 4. And we want to solve for x and y. Now, we can go about doing solving the problem in the following way. We can substitute x plus 4 for y, and we get x plus, parentheses, x plus 4, close parentheses, equals 10. Simplify, and we get 2x plus 4 equals 10. Subtract 4 from both sides, and you're left with 2x equals 6. By division, we get x equals 3. So now we plug the number 3 in for the variable x, and we get x and we get 3 plus y equals 10, subtract 3 from both sides, and we get y equals 7. Right? So this is, even if a fairly tedious process, a very clean way to solve the problem, right? This is a version of rational deliberation. That is, this is a version of reasoning that gets us a very clear-cut answer. But as you and I both know, life doesn't always feel like a math problem to be solved. In fact, let me draw your attention to a lovely passage from one of Plato's dialogues. Now, before I direct your attention to the example that I want to share with you and discuss, let me give you a little bit of background. What you're seeing is a part of a dialogue. If you want to read the whole dialogue, it's called Euthyphro, and you can find it at classics.mit.edu, and then you just do a search for Euthyphro. It's a great website. There are all sorts of wonderful ancient Greek sources here, including all of Plato's dialogues. So anyway, the context is this. Socrates is on his way to court because he is answering charges against him. He meets a man, Euthyphro, outside the courthouse. They're both surprised to see each other. Suffice it to say, they get started on a conversation about the nature of piety, right? So Euthyphro, holds a position that piety is what is dear to the gods, and impiety is what is not dear to them. And Socrates is having some trouble with this definition, and he's trying to alert Euthyphro to a difficulty, a tension between what Euthyphro claims about piety, namely that it's what's dear to the gods, and what he has initially claimed, which is that piety is about doing the universally or maybe even absolutely right thing. So we get the following. Socrates, I'm going to highlight the part that I want to read, or start the part that where I want to start reading. Socrates says, what differences creates what difference creates enmity and anger? Suppose, for example, so here's now where I'm bringing us back to my point earlier about rational deliberation. Suppose, for example, that you and I, my good friend, differ about a number. Do differences of this sort make us enemies and set us at variance with one another? Do we not go at once to arithmetic and put an end to them by sum? Or suppose that we differ about magnitudes. Do we not quickly end the differences by measuring? And do we end a controversy about heavy and light by resorting to a weighing machine? But what differences are there which cannot be thus decided, and which therefore make us angry and set us at odds with one another? I dare say that the answer does not occur to you at the moment, and therefore I will suggest that these enmities arise when the matters of difference are the just and the unjust, good and evil, honorable and dishonorable. Are not these the points about which men differ, and about which, when we are unable satisfactorily to decide our differences, you and I and all of us quarrel when we do quarrel? Okay, so part of the point here for our purposes is this. In our daily lives, sure, there is a process of reasoning that I'm going to call, since I used an example from math to highlight this, that are sort of mathematical in nature, right? There is a seeming airtight. Let me offer you one more example of non-experiential reasoning. You may have seen it before if you've watched other videos that I've presented, because I love the example. But let me offer you this other example, and then we'll talk a little bit about experiential reasoning. And then we'll try and pull some ideas together about what it is that we're doing in a critical thinking course when we set about to study modes of experiential reasoning and systems of non-experiential reasoning. That's where we're headed.
Hey, Grandma, you were born here like we were, right, Grandma? Hey, Grandma, how come you never talk about Wisconsin? Wisconsin. I told you not to ask her that. Grandma?
Great cheese comes from happy cows. Happy cows come from California.
All right, so remember, great cheese comes from happy cows. Happy cows come from California. Commercial ends. But notice what your mind wants to do, right? If it's true that great cheese comes from happy cows, and it's also true that happy cows come from California, it follows that great cheese comes from California. Don't believe me? Well, let's write it out. Okay, so I've typed out the tagline for the California cheese commercial. Great cheese comes from happy cows come from California. And I propose to you that if these two sentences are true, it follows that great cheese comes from California. We don't need to know anything about great cheese, happy cows, or California in order to see that if these two sentences are true, the relationship between great cheese and happy cows gets transferred over to California. Notice that happy cows offers us a sort of transitive relationship. The term happy cows falls out in the inference. So we don't need, as I mentioned before, any kind of knowledge of or direct experience or even indirect experience with great cheese, happy cows, or California in order to recognize that the assumed truth of these two statements forces the third. So what we're saying here is that just by an act of pure reasoning, what I mean by that is without experience about, or with, sorry, great cheese, happy cows, or California, we're able to draw the inference. The relationship between the terms, the organization of the elements in the reasoning is what yields the inference, great cheese comes from California. So one of the things that we want to understand is what it is that makes this sort of inference as good as it is, right, in more technical terms. We want to understand how we can take any argument that is that matches up with a certain sort of form of reasoning and show what follows from it, and we use rules to do that. So in the math example and the happy cows example, what you're looking at is what I'm going to call non-experiential reasoning. It is a system of thinking, right? A system that guarantees the certainty of the conclusion, of the inference, of the end of that process of deliberation, right? But as I mentioned a little bit ago, that's not the only way that we can reason. We can reason experientially, right? So think about, for example, what it is that's behind or that is in the background or that is supporting the decision that you make to go see a doctor when you're feeling unwell, right? The decision to go see a doctor when you're feeling unwell is the result of explicit or implicit or a combination of both experiential reasoning, right? So, it's the case that we live in a culture that relies on or believes in the efficacy of medicine to heal, right? So that culture is part of a years-long set of experiences of our family and friends and generations before us, and all sorts of results of scientific investigation, right? All of that is experiential reasoning, just as much as, for example, you reason experientially when you decide not to, let's say, buy a package of strawberries, because when you look at the strawberries on the top layer of the package, you notice that they're overripe. And so you, based on previous experience, based on maybe what you've been told by others, sort of this notion of common knowledge, you conclude that the strawberries lower in the package, on lower level layers of in the package, are going to be not just overripe, but spoiled, maybe moldy, right? So we can reason experientially. We do that on a daily basis, and we can reason non-experientially. So part of what we're doing in a critical thinking course is focusing on how we reason well and how we fail to reason well according to experience, or when we don't use experience. That is, when we think just about the relationships between concepts and statement structures. Now, one reason why learning the patterns and systems of reasoning experientially and non-experientially is really good for us, and why developing argumentation skills is really good for us, is we thereby have tools to think through some really difficult stuff. You've probably experienced the following in your life, and you'll experience again, I would imagine, at some point, getting into a disagreement with somebody. And at the end, or sorry, let me rephrase that. The disagreement ends with someone saying, or maybe you say yourself, well, I'm entitled to my opinion, or I have a right to my opinion. And part of the reason why you arrive at that really unsatisfying impasse is because you either yourself, or you recognize in the person with whom you disagree a lack of the tools to work your way through the problem that's at hand. Let me offer you an example by way of a nice little book called Crimes Against Logic, of what I'm talking about. So the author of this book takes up the question whether or not you have a right to your opinion, or whether or not you're entitled to your opinion. So the author, Jamie White, as I mentioned, tackles this, and he says that typically when people make this claim, right, they are trying to sort of shut down the conversation. But the problem is that saying I'm entitled to my opinion, or I have a right to my opinion, is, quote, completely irrelevant, unquote. It's irrelevant because saying I have a right to my opinion simply changes the topic at hand to a discussion of rights, or, as I mentioned before, more commonly, it just shuts down the conversation altogether, since we're very sensitive about people's rights, even if there isn't one in this case, because we assume that there is a right here that isn't to be violated. So asserting that everybody's got a right to their opinion, according to White, does two things. Sometimes one, sometimes the other, sometimes both. First, it changes the topic from whatever is at hand to the topic of rights. As such, it's irrelevant to the topic. Second, it shuts down conversation since it preys on our belief that rights are inviolate. As such, it assumes a right where none has been established. So what does it mean to say that one is entitled to one's opinion? An opinion is simply a claim, and claims are either true or false. So, part of what's being said when one claims that one is entitled to one's opinion is that one is claiming a right to have a false opinion or to have a true opinion. Let's suppose that the opinion to which one says one has a right is false. What next? Would you really want to maintain a right to hold a false opinion? If so, in what way would this right be violated if one's opinion is false? Moreover, as White writes, quote, if the opinions to which we are entitled might nevertheless be false, the entitlement cannot properly be invoked to settle a dispute. It adds no new information on the original matter. It does nothing to show that the opinion in question is true. It does seem peculiar to assert that everyone is entitled to an opinion, even if that opinion is false. The right to an opinion seems to be a belief based on a conflation of the belief that we are free to think what we want. We can think about green elephants, gold mountains, conspiracy theories, and so forth, and a right to privacy, which is a concept that is taken for granted in the United States, certainly. And the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted from the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution this right. Right? So there's a conflation when someone claims they have a right to their opinion. It seems to be a claim that conflates the belief that we're free to think what we want with the constitutionally guaranteed right to privacy. So the problem is that many of the things that we're free to think about just aren't true. And so you could say, well, fine, you're free to think about this, but that does not oblige me, as rights oblige me, to support you in that belief. Or worse yet, your freedom to think what you want, your right to your opinion, does not obligate me to also believe what you believe, to respect your belief. I mean, surely if you have a false belief, and let's suppose that that false belief puts you in some sort of imminent danger, I'm in no way obligated to respect that belief. Suppose you have a belief that there's no car coming and you want to step out into the street to cross the road. I see a car coming, I say, don't go into the street, a car is coming. And you say, well, I have a right to my opinion. I'm entitled to my opinion, and my opinion is that no car is coming, and you want to walk it to the street, right? It's not the case that I have to respect that belief. In fact, if you believe in good Samaritan obligations, I should hold you back from crossing the street, right? So, what we are doing when we're focusing on critical thinking is exhibited in this question, what does it mean to say you have a right to your opinion or you're entitled to your belief? In other words, when that sort of claim crops up in a dispute, we don't just simply back away. We might say instead, well, let's examine what we're talking about when we make this sort of claim, as White has done in his discussion. So what we want to be able to do is learn how we can analyze claims like this and how we can navigate by some really compelling intellectual tools, navigate our way through disagreements so that we can through clear, coherent, consistent, and correct reasoning, arrive at some justified claims. Okay, so you've gathered, I would imagine, from all of this that critical thinking is a rational endeavor. It requires practice and diligence, just like any new skill. It also requires time, which is something that we don't get a lot of, it seems, these days. So be patient with the process of learning critical thinking concepts and skills. I promise you, you will take them wherever you go. The critical thinking skills that you learn in a philosophy course are not skills restricted to the discipline known as philosophy. They are not subject specific. And that's a good thing. It means that you are learning to develop and hone skills that you are going to use everywhere you go in everything you do. I hope this overview of critical thinking has been helpful. It's not the only way to approach the topic, but I hope that it gives you a bit of a framework within which you can begin your critical thinking course.